The wagon creaked and rocked as it climbed the narrow mountain path. Lily sat stiffly on the wooden bench, her hands clutched around a small cloth bundle pressed tight against her chest. The morning air was heavy with fog, swallowing the tops of the pines and dulling the pale sky above. When the wagon finally stopped, the driver didn't look at her. He tossed a short nod, then clicked his tongue to the horse. The wheels turned, disappearing into the gray mist without a single backward glance. Lily stepped down slowly. The earth was damp, her thin shoes sinking into the cold mud. She took one unsteady breath, the smell of wet bark and smoke crawling into her nose. The bundle felt heavier now, as if it were made of iron. A dark wooden house stood at the edge of a clearing. Its walls were blackened by time and weather, and the single window on the upper floor was covered by a heavy curtain. The door opened with a long creak. A tall man stood in the doorway. His coat was thick and dark, the collar high against his pale, lined face. Strands of gray streaked his hair, and his eyes were as still as pond water in winter. He didn't step forward or raise a hand. He simply watched. Lily's throat tightened. She took a hesitant step, then another, each foot dragging as if pulled back by invisible hands. The air seemed to grow heavier around her shoulders with every step toward that open door. When she finally reached the porch, her bundle nearly slipped from her fingers. She adjusted it quickly, eyes fixed on the ground. The man turned without a word and disappeared inside. Lily followed. Her pulse echoed in her skull, loud and sharp. Inside, the house felt colder than the fog outside. The hallway was narrow and dark, lined with crooked wooden beams. The floorboards whined softly beneath her feet. The man's boots stopped at the base of a staircase. He turned his head slightly, his eyes cutting into her like a blade. He pointed at a narrow side room with no expression on his face. Lily nodded quickly and stepped into the room. It was small, almost bare, with a single chair pushed against the wall and a chipped basin on a wooden stand. A thin wool blanket lay folded on a narrow cot. The door closed behind her with a slow, echoing thud. She let her bundle drop to the floor. Her fingers trembled so violently she pressed them against her skirt to steady them. The walls seemed to lean in, the silence swelling until she felt it in her teeth. She moved to the cot and sat carefully, her body coiled like a cornered animal. Her eyes darted from the small window, showing only gray, to the locked door, to the basin, back to the window. Somewhere beyond the walls, she heard the faint sound of an axe striking wood, regular and distant, like a clock marking her time here. She wrapped her arms around herself, pressing her forehead to her knees. Each shallow breath felt thin and useless. Her mind clung to a single word that repeated, dull and steady as a heartbeat: survive. The door opened with a slow groan the next morning. Lily snapped upright on her cot, her arms still wrapped around her knees from the night before. Her bones felt brittle, as though her body might crumble if she moved too quickly. The man stood in the doorway, his heavy coat brushing the frame. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at her, his gaze crawling over her like cold fingers. Finally, he tilted his head slightly, and she understood. Follow. She stood, legs trembling under her. As she stepped into the hallway, the boards creaked so loudly she winced. He led her down the narrow passage into a small kitchen at the back of the house. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long, thin shadows across the plank floor. A chipped ceramic bowl sat on the table. Without a word, he pointed at it. Lily lowered her head and stepped forward, her hands shaking as she picked it up. "Eat," he said, his voice low and harsh, as if the word were scraped from stone. She swallowed hard and forced herself to sit. The bowl contained a thin, grayish porridge, barely enough to coat the bottom. Each spoonful tasted like wet ash, but she kept going, her movements small and careful. The man stood by the door, arms crossed, his face a blank wall. Every swallow echoed in her head like a threat. When she finished, she set the bowl down and looked at him quickly, afraid to linger. He uncrossed his arms and moved forward, towering over her. He reached down and tilted her chin up with 2 fingers. His skin felt rough, and the pressure forced her to meet his eyes. "You don't speak," he said. "You don't leave. You work when told. You eat when I say. You sleep when I say." Lily's throat closed. She nodded once, sharply. "Say it," he demanded. Her voice came out small and cracked. "I understand." He held her gaze for a moment longer, his eyes searching for something, a crack, a spark of defiance, then let go. She nearly collapsed forward, her breath rattling in her chest. He stepped away, grabbed the empty bowl, and set it into a dented metal basin. The sound of ceramic against metal rang through the room like a bell. "Follow," he said again. He led her to a narrow doorway at the side of the kitchen. The door opened into a yard half swallowed by fog, the edges of the fence blurred and ghost-like. Beyond the fence, the pines waited, dark and silent. A battered wooden table stood under a small overhang, piled with old tools and broken dishes. He gestured at it, then pointed at a bucket of water on the ground. "Wash," he ordered. She moved quickly, dipping a cloth into the cold water. Her fingers turned red as she scrubbed each dish, her eyes darting to the fog every few seconds. She imagined slipping into it, running between the trees, disappearing. But each time her eyes drifted too long, she felt his stare burn into her back. Hours seemed to stretch like tar. By the time she finished, her hands were raw and trembling. The man took the cloth from her, tossed it aside, and turned to go back inside. She followed, numb and hollow. He stopped by the threshold, turning his head slightly as if to remind her that every movement was his to command. Inside, she was sent to her room again. The door closed, the lock clicked. She stood for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. Then she sank to the cot, hugging herself so tightly she could barely breathe. A single thought pressed through the fog of her mind. Obey, stay quiet, survive. Lily woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside her door. She pushed herself upright, her body heavy and sore from curling up all night. For a moment she almost called out. But the memory of his hand on her chin, the threat in his voice, stopped her. When the door finally opened, it wasn't the man standing there. It was an older woman, her back bent, her hair tied in a tight knot streaked with gray. Her eyes were small and sharp, flicking over Lily without warmth. Follow me," the woman said, her voice a rough whisper, as if her throat had forgotten how to speak. Lily stepped into the hall, her feet cold on the wooden floor. The woman led her down to the kitchen, where the same chipped bowl from yesterday waited on the table. Lily sat without being told. The porridge was the same, thin, gray, tasteless. She ate it quietly, careful not to scrape the spoon against the bowl. The woman watched her from across the room, her hands moving in small, repetitive motions as she sorted herbs into jars. When Lily finished, the woman took the bowl without a word. She moved stiffly, her steps small and cautious. Lily stood and waited, unsure if she should move or speak. Finally, the woman glanced at her. "You helped today," she said. "In the garden." Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a small fenced patch of earth behind the house. Thin rows of pale cabbages and sickly carrots bent under the damp air. The soil was dark and heavy, clinging to Lily's shoes as she stepped carefully between the rows. A boy appeared at the edge of the garden. He looked about her age, maybe younger. His hair was a tangled mess, and he avoided her eyes. He carried a heavy wooden crate filled with wilted leaves and broken roots. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. His gaze was hollow, almost apologetic, before he turned away sharply, focusing on his task. The woman pointed to a patch of weeds near the fence. "Pull them, roots and all," she ordered. Lily knelt and began working, her fingers sinking into the cold, wet earth. The mud slipped under her nails, each pull sending sharp aches up her arms. She tried not to glance at the boy again, but she felt his presence like a distant echo. From time to time the woman shuffled past her, muttering to herself, her hands always busy. Lily listened carefully, trying to catch words, names, places, anything, but it was all fragments and sighs. When the sun hung low, a bell rang from inside the house. The boy dropped his crate and hurried toward the kitchen door without looking back. The woman stood, her knees cracking, and motioned for Lily to follow. Inside, the air felt even colder than outside. The man stood by the stove, his coat now gone, revealing a gray shirt stretched tight across his thin frame. His eyes tracked her as she entered, lingering on the dirt smeared across her hands and face. She froze at the doorway, the memory of his hand on her face still burning beneath her skin. "Wash," he ordered, nodding toward the small basin in the corner. Lily hurried to it, scrubbing her hands until they stung, splashing her face with the icy water. She kept her head down, watching the dirty water swirl away. When she finally turned back, he was gone. The woman was clearing the table, her movements slow and tired. Lily hesitated, then stepped toward the small hallway. The woman paused, glanced at her, and nodded once. That was all the permission she needed. Back in her room, Lily collapsed onto the cot. Her fingernails were rimmed with mud, her knees bruised from the garden stones. For the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a single silent tear. It slid down her cheek, cold and unwelcome, before she wiped it away quickly. She lay on her side, curling tighter, her mind replaying the boy's fleeting glance. Somewhere deep inside, a fragile seed of something unnamed took root, too small to be called hope, but enough to make her heart ache. That night, the house felt even colder. The wind outside pressed against the thin walls, rattling the loose window panes in her room. Lily lay awake on the narrow cot, the thin blanket barely covering her knees. Every creak in the hallway sent her heart racing. She pressed her ear to the pillow, listening. At first, she heard only the wind and the occasional drip of water from somewhere unseen. Then, footsteps, slow, careful, moving along the hall. They paused near her door. She held her breath. The air in her chest felt sharp and thin. A shadow moved across the crack beneath the door, then disappeared. Lily sat up, her hands gripping the edge of the cot. She stared at the door until her eyes watered, afraid it might open at any moment. Finally, she slid off the bed and stepped toward the small cracked mirror on the wall. In the faint moonlight, her reflection looked ghostly. Hollow cheeks, wide eyes that seemed older than they had been just days before. She reached up to touch her own face, tracing the bruise on her cheek that still throbbed from his slap. The skin felt alien under her fingertips. Suddenly, a soft sound behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing but the silent room and the faint glow of fog outside the window. She moved closer to the window, peering into the gray void beyond. The pines looked like tall, waiting figures, frozen in mid-step. Somewhere out there, she imagined the wagon trail twisting down the mountain, swallowed by the fog. A shiver ran down her spine. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to the cold glass. When she opened them again, she noticed something odd on the floor. Near the corner of the room, where the wooden planks didn't quite meet, a thin thread of fabric stuck out. She crouched, pulling at it gently. The edge of a cloth bundle emerged, dusty and stiff. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside she found a small hair ribbon, faded blue, and a cracked wooden comb. She stared at the items for a long moment, her mind flooding with questions. Whose things were these? Why were they hidden? Lily folded the cloth carefully and pushed it back into the crack. The objects felt heavy in her hands, as if they carried a voice she could almost hear, but not understand. When she stood, she felt her knees wobble. She clutched the edge of the bed for balance, her breaths sharp and uneven. She backed away from the corner, curling once more onto the cot. The blanket smelled faintly of smoke and mold. Somewhere down the hallway, she heard a door close, firm and final. She imagined the man standing outside her door, listening, measuring her silence. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the ribbon again, the comb, the fragile trace of another girl, another story left behind in the cracks of this cold house. The hours dragged on, slow and thick as tar. Lily drifted in and out of a restless half-sleep, her mind stuck between the memory of the man's eyes and the echo of the girl who might have come before her. In the earliest gray light of dawn, she opened her eyes. Her body felt heavy, her throat dry, but something inside her had shifted, a faint, trembling awareness that she was not alone in her suffering. And though the thought was small and sharp, like a splinter under the skin, it stayed with her as she listened to the first heavy steps begin again in the hall. Morning came in a dull wash of gray. Lily's eyes felt swollen, her mouth dry and sour. She lay still, listening to the house breathe around her, the deep wooden groans, the quiet shuffle of feet far below. Then the door swung open. The old woman, Martha, she had learned, appeared in the frame, her face pinched and expressionless. She jerked her chin, signaling Lily to follow. Lily pushed herself up, her joints stiff from the cold. She stepped into the hallway and trailed Martha down to the kitchen. The air smelled of burnt coffee and wet ash. On the table sat a single piece of bread and a chipped mug of water. Lily sat down quickly, her hands trembling as she lifted the crust to her mouth. She chewed slowly, trying not to make noise. The man entered moments later. His heavy boots struck the floor with a deliberate, measured rhythm. He crossed the room without looking at her, poured himself a cup of something dark, then stood by the window, staring into the fog. The tension in the room thickened until it felt like wet cloth against her skin. Lily swallowed, her throat tight. Martha worked in silence, cleaning an old iron pan. Her shoulders were hunched, every movement small and efficient. When Lily finished her bread, she placed her hands on her lap and waited. The man finally turned, his pale eyes sliding over her. "Clean the dishes," he said. She rose quickly, taking the plate and mug to the basin. The water was ice-cold, biting at her fingertips. She focused on the task, her mind folded into itself like a fist. She placed the clean dish on the rack when her elbow bumped a glass on the edge of the counter. It teetered, then fell. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Martha's breath hitched sharply, her hand frozen mid-wipe. Lily stood paralyzed, shards of glass glinting at her feet like tiny teeth. The man set down his cup with a heavy thud. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his boots scraping the boards. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, squeezing so hard she cried out. He yanked her forward, his face inches from hers. She could smell the bitterness of his breath, the sharp tang of sweat and smoke. "You think you can break things here?" he hissed. She tried to shake her head, words caught in her throat. His free hand rose and struck her across the face. The impact knocked her sideways, her vision flashing white for a moment. She stumbled to the floor, her hand flying to her cheek. The taste of blood spread in her mouth, hot and metallic. "Pick it up," he ordered. His voice was low, almost calm now, which terrified her even more. Lily scrambled on her hands and knees, gathering the glass pieces with shaking fingers. A shard sliced into her palm, but she didn't stop. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her tears mixing with the dirt and blood. She could feel Martha watching, but the old woman didn't move, didn't speak. The boy hovered in the doorway for a moment, his face pale and eyes wide, before he vanished down the hall. When Lily finally finished, she stood, her head bowed low, her body shaking. The man stepped back, straightened his coat, and left the room without another word. The door closed behind him like a judge's gavel. Lily stood frozen, the sting in her cheek pulsing in waves. Blood dripped slowly from her cut palm, dotting the wooden floor. Martha approached and handed her a rag. Their eyes met briefly. A flicker of something passed between them, a wordless sorrow too heavy to hold. Lily pressed the rag to her hand, turned away, and leaned against the sink. Her body trembled violently, as though trying to shake out all the fear at once. In that moment she felt smaller than she ever had before, reduced to a quiet, raw bundle of bone and breath. But deep inside, beneath the terror and the pain, something else began to flicker. A tiny ember of anger, so faint it could barely warm her thoughts. Yet it glowed, buried in the darkness of her mind. Lily spent the rest of the day moving like a shadow. Every movement felt stiff and rehearsed, her head low, her hands careful not to brush against anything that might fall or break. Martha kept her busy in the kitchen, sorting roots and washing old jars. The boy moved in and out silently, never meeting Lily's eyes. Each time he appeared, her heart jolted, as if he might say something, do something. But he never did. By late afternoon, her palm throbbed under the rag. The cut was deep, and each touch of cold water sent sharp pain crawling up her arm. Still, she worked, afraid of slowing down or stopping. When the man returned from outside, he carried a small sack of grain over his shoulder. He paused in the doorway, scanning the room. His eyes landed on her hand, wrapped and spotted with red. He sneered slightly, but said nothing. Martha kept her head down, hands moving faster, as though hoping to vanish into her work. After supper, Martha handed Lily a dull knife and pointed to a crate of carrots on the floor. Lily knelt beside it, peeling slowly, her thoughts swirling like fog. The boy stepped in again to fetch wood for the stove. As he passed, she whispered, her voice so low it felt like a breath rather than a sound. "Please help me." He stopped mid-step, his back to her. For a moment the room felt suspended, every sound and movement frozen. She saw his shoulders tighten, his fingers grip the wood harder. But he didn't turn. He resumed his steps quickly, disappearing into the back room. Lily's chest sank. She felt as though her words had fallen straight to the floor, shattering like the glass from the morning. Before she could process it, Martha's shadow loomed beside her. The woman's eyes were sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough!" Martha snapped, her voice harsh and thin. She grabbed Lily's arm and pulled her up roughly. Lily stumbled, the knife falling from her hands and clattering across the floor. Martha dragged her toward the hallway, ignoring her stifled gasps of pain. At the end of the hall, Martha shoved her into the small room. The door slammed shut behind her, followed by the click of the lock sliding into place. Lily stood frozen in the dark. The only light came from the thin gray of the window, barely enough to shape the room. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. Footsteps retreated slowly, then silence. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, her back against the door. The wound in her palm throbbed violently now, pulsing in time with her panicked breath. She wrapped her good hand over it, rocking slightly. The small, fragile ember of anger she had felt earlier now seemed smothered under the thick blanket of fear. She scanned the room as though looking for a crack, a sign, a voice, anything that might anchor her. The old basin stood still in the corner. The mirror reflected only a vague shape, her own outline warped and distant. She curled up on the floor, her forehead resting on her knees. Her mind replayed the boy's stiff back, the way he refused to turn. In that single moment she had dared to hope, a dangerous, sharp hope, and it had dissolved into the stale air of the hallway. A distant door closed somewhere in the house. Then the house settled into a heavy, watchful silence. She pressed her good hand to her face, feeling the salt of her tears mix with the sting of her cut. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and shame, the ember still glowed faintly. But tonight it felt far away, like a lantern glimpsed through thick fog, impossible to reach and almost easy to forget. The night crawled by in slow, stifling waves. Lily lay on the floor for hours before finally dragging herself onto the narrow cot. Her mind was a restless pool of images, the boy's back turned away, the sharp snap of Martha's voice, the man's cold stare. When the first gray light seeped through the window, her eyes opened, dry and stinging. Her palm throbbed with each heartbeat, the rag now stiff and dark with dried blood. She sat up slowly, every joint aching. The air felt heavy on her skin, as if the walls themselves were pressing down. She stood and shuffled toward the corner of the room, drawn to the hidden crack where she had found the ribbon and comb before. She crouched down, her fingers tracing the edge of the loose floorboard. This time she pushed harder, her nails scraping the wood until a small gap widened. Something crinkled beneath. She reached in carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, the paper crackling like dry leaves. The handwriting was small and hurried, letters leaning as though they had been scrawled in fear. "If you find this, know that I tried. My name is Emily. I thought I could escape, but he always knows. Don't trust them. Not the woman, not the boy. The woods are not safe. He watches everything. Pray you leave before he breaks you. Pray you are stronger than I was." Lily's breath snagged in her throat. Her vision blurred as she read and reread the words, each line sinking deeper, like needles under her skin. Emily, a name, a girl who had been here before, whose ghost still clung to the walls and floors. Lily pressed the letter to her chest, rocking slightly. The tiny ember inside her pulsed again, stronger this time, pain and horror feeding it like dry tinder. A sudden noise jolted her. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. She shoved the letter back into the crack, covering it with trembling fingers. The door handle rattled, then turned. Martha entered, her face pinched tighter than usual. She carried a small bundle of linen and set it on the cot, without looking at Lily. "Clean yourself," Martha muttered. Her eyes darted to the floor, then to the door, as though afraid to stay. Lily stood, frozen. The woman turned to leave, but paused at the threshold. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. In that second, Lily thought she saw a flicker of something, regret, or perhaps pity, before the old woman's expression slammed shut again like a door. The lock clicked softly behind her. Lily lowered herself to the cot, unwrapping the bundle. Inside were a thin cloth shirt and a basin of cold water. She dipped the cloth into the basin and began wiping her face, careful around the bruise on her cheek and the cuts on her palm. The water felt like a slap, sharp and cleansing. As she cleaned, her mind replayed Emily's words. Don't trust them. Not the woman, not the boy. She thought of the boy's averted eyes, the old woman's sharp commands, the careful silence that choked every corner of the house. She wrapped her injured hand again with a strip of clean cloth from the bundle. Each turn of the fabric felt like a vow. She would not end up like Emily. For the first time since arriving, Lily felt something more than pure terror. A thin, determined thread wove itself through her fear, stitching her thoughts together in a new pattern. She had to watch. She had to listen. She had to wait. If there was a way out, she would find it. She squeezed her hand into a fist, feeling the pain spike, reminding her she was still alive. Outside, the fog rolled between the pines, thick and restless. Somewhere beyond it lay a road, an escape, a future she could barely imagine. Lily stood slowly, her legs unsteady but her eyes sharper than before. She moved to the window and pressed her palm to the cold glass, her breath forming a faint halo. Beneath the fear, beneath the bruises and blood, that ember inside her flared, small but stubborn, and suddenly undeniable. The day crawled forward under a thick blanket of fog. Lily was led into the kitchen by Martha, who moved with her usual silent urgency. The man sat at the table, sharpening a long, thin knife. The steady scrape of metal against stone filled the room, each stroke biting at Lily's nerves. She stood by the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed on the floor. Martha handed her a small pile of potatoes and gestured to a stool in the corner. Lily obeyed, peeling slowly, careful not to drop or break anything. Every time the blade scraped, Lily's shoulder flinched. The man didn't look at her, but his presence filled every corner of the kitchen. After a while he stood abruptly. The knife in his hand gleamed under the weak lamplight. He looked down at Martha. "Bring her," he said simply, before striding out into the hallway. Martha's lips tightened into a thin line. She grabbed Lily's arm firmly, her fingers digging into the bruises already blooming beneath Lily's skin. They stepped outside into the gray, heavy air. The fog clung to Lily's face, cold and damp. The barn loomed in front of them, darker than she had remembered, its doors gaping open like a silent maw. Martha pushed her forward. Lily stumbled, catching herself against the rough wooden frame of the barn door. The man stood inside near a pile of coiled rope and sacks of feed. He didn't speak. Instead, he pointed to a corner where a pile of old rags and straw formed a crude bed. "Stay," he ordered. Lily felt her pulse thundering in her ears. She moved to the corner, sinking to her knees in the straw. The smell of damp hay and old sweat rose around her, sharp and suffocating. The man stepped forward, standing over her. His eyes scanned her face with slow, deliberate cruelty. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Martha followed, sliding the heavy barn door shut behind her. The metal latch slammed into place, echoing inside the barn like a gunshot. Lily leapt to her feet and ran to the door, her hands scrambling at the latch. But it wouldn't move. She pounded her fists against the wood, her cries muffled by the thick fog outside. She slid down the door, her breaths ragged and shallow. Around her, the barn creaked and groaned, each sound magnified in the silence. A single shaft of weak light filtered in through a crack high up on the wall, illuminating floating dust like tiny, ghostly insects. She hugged her knees, her forehead pressed to them, trying to quiet the scream building in her throat. Hours crawled by. Her fingers turned numb from the cold seeping into the straw. Every small rustle or creak made her flinch, her mind playing endless tricks. Footsteps, whispers, the echo of Emily's last words. She imagined the man standing just beyond the door, listening to her sobs, savoring her fear. She imagined Martha's eyes, sharp and cold, turning away. She imagined the boy's hunched shoulders, his silent betrayal. Finally, her sobs slowed. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts a tangled mess of grief and rage. In that stillness, something inside her shifted. She thought of the letter hidden beneath her floorboard, of the blue ribbon, of the comb. Silent witnesses to another girl's story. Lily lifted her head slowly. Her eyes, red and swollen, narrowed in the dim light. The ember inside her pulsed again, brighter now. They had thrown her into this barn to break her spirit, to remind her she was nothing but a body to be ordered, silenced, used. But tonight, among the straw and shadows, Lily felt something else awaken, a raw, silent vow that she would not vanish like Emily. She forced her body upright, leaning back against the wall. Her breaths were slow now, deliberate. She pressed her injured hand against her chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her ribs. Outside, the fog moved like a living thing, swallowing the world beyond the walls. But inside her, a new shape began to form, fragile but sharp as a blade. She closed her eyes and waited, no longer trembling, no longer entirely afraid. When dawn finally broke, Lily didn't move right away. The pale light slipped through the cracks in the barn walls, turning the dust into tiny, glowing threads that drifted slowly through the cold air. She sat still in the corner, her back against the rough boards, her breath steady and slow. Her body ached from the straw and the chill, but her mind felt sharp, newly honed by the long night. Eventually, she heard the latch click. The barn door creaked open, and the man's silhouette appeared in the heavy fog beyond. He stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the scattered hay. His eyes flicked to her, waiting. Lily stood without being told. Her movements were stiff but deliberate, her eyes fixed on his face. For the first time, she did not lower her gaze. He paused mid-step, as if taken aback by this small defiance. His pale eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, stopping inches from her. She felt the cold breath of the morning on her skin, mixing with the heat of her fear. "You think you're strong now?" he asked, his voice low and quiet, almost calm. Lily didn't answer. Her silence was no longer the silence of terror, but of choice. The man's lips tightened. He lifted his hand slowly, as though savoring the gesture, then struck her cheek hard. Her head snapped to the side, but she didn't fall. She turned back to face him, her eyes burning through the sting. The corner of his mouth twitched. Amusement or irritation, she couldn't tell. He grabbed her wrist roughly, squeezing so hard she felt her bones grind. "You listen to me," he hissed. "You are nothing here, nothing but a body to feed and use. You breathe because I allow it." She felt her knees weaken, the pain shooting up her arm like lightning, but inside the ember glowed, steady and bright. Finally, he shoved her backward. She stumbled but caught herself against the stall door. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, fast waves, her eyes never leaving his. For a long moment they stood in a silent battle, his towering frame, her small trembling form. But something invisible had shifted. He turned abruptly and strode toward the door. Without looking back, he called over his shoulder, "Martha!" The old woman appeared in the fog, her eyes hollow, her mouth drawn tight. She stepped aside as he passed. "Take her inside. Feed her," he ordered, before disappearing into the mist. Martha looked at Lily for a long time, her gaze heavy with something that might have been pity or simple exhaustion. Then she stepped forward and took Lily's arm gently, her fingers no longer claws but soft and hesitant. Lily followed her across the yard, her steps slow but steady. Inside the kitchen, the warmth hit her face, making her head swim. Martha guided her to a chair and placed a bowl of thin broth in front of her. Lily's hand shook as she lifted the spoon. Each swallow felt like swallowing rocks, her throat raw from the cold and from holding back screams. Martha hovered nearby, her movements restless. Once she started to speak, but stopped, her mouth working silently before she turned away. Lily finished the bowl and pushed it back carefully. She watched Martha's back, her mind replaying Emily's warning. "Don't trust them. Not the woman. Not the boy." Martha finally turned, her eyes searching Lily's face. For a moment, Lily saw something, a crack in the mask, a tremor of regret or fear, but it vanished just as quickly. "Rest," Martha muttered, gesturing toward the hallway. Lily stood, her legs trembling under her. She moved slowly toward her small room, feeling Martha's gaze on her back the whole way. Inside, she sank onto the cot, the thin blanket rough against her skin. She curled onto her side, clutching her bandaged hand to her chest. She could still feel his grip on her wrist, the echo of his words like poison in her blood. But beneath it all, the ember pulsed stronger than ever, warming the cold spaces inside her. She wasn't free, not yet, but she knew now that she wasn't entirely broken either. Outside the window, the fog began to lift, revealing the jagged line of the pines in the distance, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. Lily closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw Emily's letter, the blue ribbon, the comb. They felt closer now, almost like allies in the darkness. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another chance to watch, to learn, to wait. And when that chance finally appeared, she would take it, no matter the cost. The next morning arrived in a hush of pale light and restless fog. Lily woke early, her body stiff but her mind alert, eyes moving quickly around the room as though checking for unseen threats. A soft knock came at the door before it opened. Martha entered carrying a small bundle of clothes. Her movements were careful, almost reluctant, as if each step took great effort. "Wash and change," Martha said quietly, placing the bundle on the end of the cot. Lily took the clothes without a word. As Martha turned to leave, Lily caught a glimpse of her face, a tightness in her jaw, a twitch beneath her eye, a sign of something unspoken. When the door closed, Lily unfolded the clothes. They were plain and worn, but cleaner than what she had been wearing. As she dressed, she moved slowly, her fingers brushing over each seam, each patch. She thought of Emily's letter again. Don't trust them. Not the woman. Not the boy. Lily's mind replayed every small look, every averted gaze, every sudden silence she had witnessed. Martha's eyes, always sharp, always scanning, had begun to seem less like watchfulness and more like a quiet confession. After dressing, she stepped cautiously into the hallway. Martha stood waiting, her back to Lily. When she turned, their eyes locked for a long moment. "Kitchen," Martha finally said, her voice dry and thin. Lily followed her to the kitchen, where the man sat at the table. His hands rested flat on the wood, fingers tapping an uneven rhythm. He watched her enter, his eyes sweeping over her new clothes with a flicker of amusement or disdain. It was impossible to tell. "You'll clean the attic today," he said. "Take the boy with you." Lily's breath caught. The boy appeared from the shadows near the doorway, his hair messy, eyes fixed firmly on the floor. The man stood abruptly. "Do as she tells you," he said to the boy before leaving the room. His boots thudded down the hallway and out the front door, fading into the fog beyond. Martha nodded toward the narrow staircase. "Go," she said, her voice like a brittle twig. Lily climbed first, her hand skimming the railing. The boy followed, his steps hesitant. At the top, the attic door stood ajar. The air was heavy with dust, old cloth, and forgotten things. Broken crates, sacks, and bundles of dried herbs crowded the floor. Light seeped through a single small window, pale and sickly. They moved quietly, pushing aside boxes and sweeping dirt into a corner. At one point, Lily turned and caught the boy watching her. His eyes were wide, his lips parted slightly as though he wanted to speak. She froze, the broom handle trembling in her grip. "Did she—" The boy started, his voice a hushed rasp. Then he stopped, glancing quickly at the stairway. Lily stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Emily," she whispered. The boy's eyes snapped back to hers, terrified. He nodded once, a sharp, quick movement. Lily's breath caught. The room felt smaller, the air tighter. "She tried to leave," he whispered, each word like a drop of water in dry soil. "She almost made it. He found her. After that, she was gone." Lily's hands tightened around the broom. Her vision blurred, tears welling up despite her effort to hold them back. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Help me." The boy looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his eyes, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "I can't," he stammered. "He'll kill me. He'll kill us both." Lily stepped even closer, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "Please," she repeated, her voice softer now, almost a plea to the walls rather than to him. The boy's breath came faster. He looked at the window at the door, then back at her. Finally, he swallowed hard. "Dawn," he whispered. "If you get to the fence at dawn, I can open the gate. But only once. Only then." Lily's heart thudded so loudly she feared it would echo off the attic walls. She nodded, her fingers trembling against his arm. A noise downstairs snapped them apart. They turned toward the stairway, listening. Footsteps, slow and heavy. The man returning. The boy dropped his eyes and hurried to the far corner, grabbing a sack and pretending to sort its contents. Lily bent down quickly, sweeping dust into a small pile. The attic door creaked open. The man's silhouette filled the frame, his eyes cold and searching. "Done?" he barked. They both nodded, neither daring to speak. "Down," he ordered. Lily followed the boy down the narrow stairs, her legs shaking. In the kitchen, Martha stood frozen by the table, her hands twisting a rag. Lily did not look at her. She felt the weight of the boy's promise inside her, fragile, dangerous, but alive. As she stepped into her room and closed the door, her breath escaped in a trembling rush. She pressed her forehead to the wall, her hand gripping the rough wood. "Tomorrow." That single word pulsed through her veins, lighting the ember inside her into a tiny, desperate flame. That night the house felt more alive than ever. Every sound, the groan of the rafters, the scratch of branches against the walls, echoed in Lily's bones. She lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing faster than her breath. Dawn. The word replayed in her head like a bell tolling in a distant valley. Each repetition pushed her further from sleep, further from the thick fog of fear that had ruled her since she arrived. At some point she rose from the cot and stepped lightly to the window. The pines outside stood like silent sentinels, their outlines smudged by the moonlit mist. Somewhere beyond them waited the fence, the final barrier between her and the world she had almost forgotten. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass. The skin on her cheek still carried the memory of his slap, the echo of his voice telling her she was nothing. But beneath that pain, something harder and brighter thrummed, the fragile promise the boy had given her. She moved back to the cot, crouching beside it. Slowly, she pulled at the loose floorboard and slipped her fingers inside. Her hand closed around the folded letter, the blue ribbon, the comb. She took them out one by one, laying them on the blanket as if arranging sacred relics. "Don't trust them. Not the woman, not the boy." Emily's warning gnawed at her, but Lily felt the boy's voice in the attic, the tremor in it, the raw edge of desperation. She saw the fear in his eyes when he spoke of the gate. It wasn't betrayal she had seen. It was terror. She refolded the letter carefully and tucked it under her dress, against her heart. She tied the blue ribbon around her wrist, the fabric frayed and delicate. The comb she placed back in its hiding spot, a silent farewell to the girl who had tried before her. A soft noise snapped her head up. Footsteps, hesitant and slow, crept down the hallway. She held her breath, listening. A shadow passed beneath the crack in her door, pausing. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The shadow moved on. Lily exhaled shakily and sat back against the wall. The cold seeped into her bones, but she hardly noticed. Her mind turned over and over the path she needed to take, down the hall, past the kitchen, through the yard, to the fence. She would have only moments, only one chance. She pressed her palm to her bandaged hand, feeling the pulse beneath. It was faster than usual, as if her body was urging her forward, preparing her to run. Hours stretched into an endless string of seconds. The moon shifted, shadows moved along the walls like slow ghosts. At last, the blackness outside began to pale. The first fragile light of dawn pressed against the edges of the pines. Lily stood slowly, her knees weak, but her mind sharpened to a single point. She pulled on her thin shawl, tying it tight around her shoulders. She looked once more at the floorboard, sealing it shut with a soft push. She stepped to the door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Her hand hovered over the latch. Her breath caught and held. In that moment, she saw all the rooms, all the locked doors, the kitchen with its cold basin, the attic filled with dust and broken dreams. She felt all the small deaths she had survived since arriving. She pushed the latch gently. The door gave way with a soft click. She slipped into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the boards. The house was still. The walls held their breath with her. At the end of the hall, the kitchen door stood ajar. Beyond it, the yard stretched into the mist, pale and wet. The fence loomed somewhere beyond, hidden but waiting. She stepped forward, one slow, careful foot at a time. As she crossed the kitchen, she glanced back once. The shadows felt different now, thinner, less certain. She reached the door and paused on the threshold. The cold air bit at her face, but she didn't flinch. She looked toward the barn. A figure moved near the fence, the boy, barely visible through the mist. Their eyes met for an instant, even from afar. His head jerked in a quick nod, his hand already on the gate latch. Lily swallowed hard. Every muscle in her body quivered. Then she stepped out into the yard, her steps gathering speed, each one louder in her head than the last. The fence, the fog, the boy, all of it pulled her forward, each step a beat in the silent drum of her heart. The cold hit Lily like a slap as soon as she stepped fully into the yard. The fog clung to her skin, soaking through her thin shawl in seconds. Her bare feet sank into the wet dirt, each step sending sharp needles of pain through her legs. But she didn't stop. She kept her eyes fixed on the fence, on the small figure waiting by the gate. The boy's outline wavered in the mist, as if he might vanish at any moment. Behind her, the house loomed. Silent for now, she strained to hear any sound, a creak of a door, the heavy thud of boots on the porch. Nothing. Her breath came in ragged clouds. Each inhale tasted of wet wood and iron, each exhale a ghost fleeing into the morning. The boy's hand was already on the latch. He looked over his shoulder again and again, his shoulders tense, his head jerking with every imagined noise. Lily stumbled forward, her fingers brushing against the rough wood of a barrel as she passed. Her body felt heavy and brittle, as if she might shatter if she slowed down even for a moment. She reached the barn. The door gaped open like a mouth, black and cold. She hesitated, her mind flashing with the memory of that night inside, the straw scratching her skin, the echo of her own sobs. She pushed past it, her eyes locked on the fence. When she finally drew close, the boy's eyes met hers. For a moment, they stood frozen in that fog-soaked yard. Two fragile souls, held together by one thin strand of shared desperation. "Quick!" he whispered, his voice cracked and thin. "He'll hear." Lily reached out and touched his arm. The fabric was damp and trembling under her fingers. "Thank you," she mouthed, no sound leaving her lips. The boy flinched as though her touch burned him. He looked past her toward the house, then pushed the gate open with a violent shove. The hinges shrieked, slicing through the fog like a scream. Lily's heart jolted. She spun toward the house, expecting to see the man in the doorway, his eyes like ice, his hand already reaching for her. But no one came. The yard stayed silent, thick with breathless tension. She turned back, her feet already slipping on the wet grass beyond the fence. She pulled herself through the narrow opening, the rough wood tearing at her shawl, at her arms. The boy let go of the gate, stepping back, his face pale and wide-eyed. "Run," he said, his voice now a harsh, urgent hiss. "Run!" Lily didn't look back. She pressed forward, her feet catching on roots and slick mud. Branches clawed at her arms, her hair, but she pushed through, each heartbeat roaring in her ears. Behind her, she thought she heard a door slam open, a voice cutting through the morning like a blade. She ducked under a low branch, her fingers tearing at the wet moss as she pulled herself up a shallow slope. Her breath came in jagged, raw bursts. Somewhere in the distance a crow called out, a sharp, lonely sound that cut through the fog. She ran. Through the wet pines, past the jagged stones, across the muddy clearing that threatened to pull her down with every step. Her body screamed in pain, her hand throbbed, her knees buckled, her lungs burned. But something deeper carried her forward. That ember inside her had become a flame now, pushing her beyond the edge of her fear, beyond the edge of her own strength. She stumbled, fell face first into the mud, her hands sinking deep. For a split second, the world blurred into a wash of gray and brown. Then she forced herself up, her legs shaking violently. She wiped her face with her torn sleeve, smearing dirt and blood across her cheek. Ahead, the fog parted slightly, revealing the thin line of an overgrown trail winding down the mountainside. A path, a way out. She lunged forward, stumbling into the first steps of her freedom. Behind her, the first shouts rose. The man's voice, rough and furious, tore through the trees. The sound chased her, pulled at her like claws, but she didn't stop. Each step felt like the swing of an axe against heavy wood, slow, labored, but determined. She whispered to herself, a single word carried on each ragged breath. Survive. And with every repetition, the world beyond the fence felt closer, more real. Not just a dream, but a place waiting to be claimed by her battered, defiant spirit. Lily tore down the trail, her feet slipping on wet roots and loose rocks. The fog clung to her like wet cloth, making every breath heavy, every step blind and desperate. Behind her, the man's voice roared, echoing off the trees like thunder. She heard branches snap, feet pounding. He was coming fast. Driven by rage, she could almost feel on her skin. She stumbled again, her knee slamming into a sharp stone. Pain shot up her leg, white-hot and blinding. She let out a strangled cry, but forced herself to crawl forward, clawing at the mud with trembling fingers. She pushed upright, swaying on unsteady legs. The path ahead blurred and shifted with each heartbeat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to keep moving, no matter the pain. Then she saw it. A narrow opening in the pines, a low ridge that curved away from the main trail. Beyond it, a faint glimmer of open sky. She lunged toward it, her body moving as if it no longer belonged to her. Each step felt like it might be her last. A shout behind her. Closer now. The man's breath, ragged and furious, sounded almost in her ear. She ducked under a hanging branch, her shoulder scraping hard against the bark. The ribbon around her wrist snagged and tore free, floating down like a fallen petal. She wanted to turn, to grab it. Emily's ribbon, her silent companion. But the man's steps crashed through the undergrowth behind her, tearing that thought from her mind. She burst through the trees into a small clearing. The open space felt like a gasp of air after drowning. But she had no time to savor it. She had to keep going. Her legs buckled, but she forced them forward. She glanced back once, just enough to see the man's silhouette appear in the trees, his arms swinging like blades. Their eyes met across the clearing. His face twisted, pale and monstrous in the weak morning light. Lily's heart hammered so hard she thought it might tear free from her ribs. She turned and ran again, her hands clawing at the air, her breath a high, thin wheeze. Suddenly, her foot caught on a hidden root. She pitched forward, slamming into the ground. The air burst from her lungs in a single sharp gasp. She rolled over, mud clinging to her hair and face. She saw him advancing across the clearing, each step deliberate, unstoppable. She scrambled backward, pushing with her elbows and heels, her injured hand throbbing violently. Her back hit a moss-covered rock, stopping her escape. The man stopped a few steps away. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a cold, triumphant fury. "Did you really think you could leave?" he spat, his voice low and trembling with rage. Lily's body shook uncontrollably. Her eyes darted around, the trees, the rocks, the sky, looking for anything, any miracle. But there was nothing but the cold, empty woods. He stepped closer, reaching for her. His hand, pale and rough, closed around her ankle. A sudden surge of something wild and sharp rose in her chest. She kicked, her free foot striking his shin with all the strength she had left. He roared, stumbling backward. The grip on her ankle loosened for a moment. Enough! She twisted onto her side and lunged forward, crawling past him, her fingers sinking into the mud. She didn't look back. She pulled herself to her feet again, each step a scream of pain from her battered body. Ahead she saw a break in the trees, a narrow, steep slope leading down. Without thinking, she hurled herself forward. The slope turned to a slide of wet earth and roots, sending her crashing down. Branches whipped her arms and face, rocks tore at her clothes. But she didn't stop. At the bottom she lay in a heap, her breath ragged and thin. She pushed up on her elbows, her vision swimming. Behind her, the man's furious shout echoed down the slope. She knew he would follow, but for a moment she had space, a precious, thin thread of time. She forced herself upright, staggering toward a gap in the trees that seemed to open into lighter air. Each step was a battle, each heartbeat a fragile victory. She didn't know where the path led. She didn't know if she would make it beyond the next breath. But she kept moving, because in that clearing, in that single moment when she had looked into his eyes, she had seen it. Not invincibility, but fear. And for the first time, she understood. He was afraid of losing control, afraid of her defiance, afraid of the girl who refused to be silent. That thought burned in her, brighter than pain, hotter than fear. She whispered to herself again, voice rough and broken, "Survive." And with that word on her lips, she threw herself forward into the waiting trees, into whatever lay beyond. Lily stumbled forward, the forest closing in around her like a living creature. Her breath tore from her lungs in ragged, uneven bursts. The cold air bit at her throat, each inhale sharp as broken glass. Behind her, she heard the man crashing through the undergrowth, his curses carried on the damp morning wind. She dared not look back. The trees pressed tighter, the branches clawing at her face and arms. Each step felt like running through a wall of thorns. She tripped on a hidden root and fell hard, her hands sinking into the mud. For a moment she lay there, her body screaming for rest. Every part of her trembled, her skin cold and slick with sweat and blood. But deep inside, that small flame, the ember that had started as a whisper, roared now, filling her veins with a fierce, wild energy. She pushed herself up, forcing her legs to move. Ahead, a thin ribbon of light shimmered through the trees. She didn't know if it was another path or the edge of the mountain, but it pulled at her, a thread of hope in the gray labyrinth. She pushed branches aside with her bandaged hand, ignoring the fresh pain as the fabric tore and blood welled up again. Her feet slipped on wet leaves, her knee buckling. She caught herself against a trunk, her head spinning. The world tilted and blurred, but she held on, her fingers digging into the bark. She forced her eyes open. The light ahead was closer now. She lurched forward again, every muscle on the edge of collapse. Behind her, the man's footsteps grew louder, closer, the sound of a predator closing in on wounded prey. She stumbled into a small clearing, the morning sky breaking open above her in a pale, washed-out glow. Her eyes widened at the sudden openness, the sense of space after so many days of tight, suffocating rooms and corridors. She could almost taste freedom. Then a hand closed around her hair from behind and yanked her backward. She screamed, her body twisting violently as she fell to the ground. The man stood over her, his face twisted in a mask of rage and triumph. His eyes were wild, his chest heaving. "Thought you could run?" he spat, his voice raw and broken. "You think you can just leave me? Like a stray dog?" Lily struggled, her hands clawing at the dirt, her feet kicking against his legs. He grabbed her wrist, squeezing so hard her vision flared white with pain. She felt her strength draining, her body beginning to go limp. But in the corner of her mind, Emily's words echoed, a final silent plea not to give in. She looked up at him, her face streaked with mud and blood. His hand rose above her, ready to strike. In a final surge of blind instinct, she grabbed a rock beside her and swung it upward with all her remaining strength. The rock hit his temple with a sickening thud. His eyes widened in shock. His grip loosened, and he staggered backward, his arms flailing. Lily didn't wait. She scrambled to her feet, gasping, and stumbled away from him. She heard him fall to his knees, then crash face first into the mud. Her breath ripped through her chest as she bolted forward again, the pale light ahead calling her like a lighthouse. She pushed through a final curtain of thin branches and burst onto a narrow trail carved into the mountainside. The forest dropped steeply to one side, and beyond it she saw the valley stretching out in ghostly patches of early morning fog. She staggered forward, each step a raw act of will. She didn't dare look back. The trail curved sharply, disappearing behind a wall of rock. She followed it blindly, her eyes burning with sweat and tears. She didn't know if the man would get up again, if he would come after her once more. She didn't know if her body would hold another minute. But she knew one thing. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer just running to survive. She was running to reclaim her life, her voice, herself. As she rounded the curve, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees, clutching at the dirt, her entire body shaking. Above her the sky began to lighten, pale bands of blue bleeding into the gray. She pressed her forehead to the earth, tears spilling from her eyes, her mouth open in a silent cry that only the morning heard. In that moment she felt the weight of everything she had lost, her old life, her safety, her innocence, and yet, beneath it all, something fierce and alive remained. She forced herself up one more time, her body screaming in protest, because she was not done yet. Not until she was free. Lily stood on the narrow trail, her legs trembling beneath her, her hands hanging limp at her sides. Each breath felt like dragging shards of glass through her throat. The valley below slowly emerged from the fog, pale green fields and dark smudges of distant woods stretching out beneath a weak morning sun. The light felt foreign on her skin, as if she had been underground for years. She took one shaky step forward, then another. Her foot slipped on a loose stone, and she nearly collapsed. She caught herself against the rock wall, her fingers scraping against rough stone until they bled again. She pressed her forehead to the cold surface, her eyes squeezed shut. The wind from the valley rose to meet her, carrying scents of pine and wet earth, scents that felt both painfully familiar and impossibly distant. Behind her, the forest remained silent. She did not hear footsteps or shouting. She did not know if the man still lay in the clearing or if he crawled toward her, hatred and hunger driving him forward. She forced herself to look back once more, her chest tightening. The trees stood still, the fog slowly burning away in the weak sunlight. Nothing moved. For a brief moment, relief crashed over her in a dizzying wave. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the dirt trail, her hands sinking into the gravel. She stayed there, forehead to the ground, her body heaving with silent sobs. Every muscle seemed to release at once, years of terror and tension flooding out of her in broken, shallow breaths. Then, slowly, she pushed herself up. Her limbs felt hollow, as if carved from paper, but she stood. She looked down at her bandaged hand, now soaked and dark with fresh blood. The blue ribbon was gone, left behind in the forest like a phantom's whisper. She thought of Emily, the girl who had almost made it, whose voice had guided her in the dark. Lily closed her eyes and imagined her standing in the fog, silent but fierce, urging her forward. Lily turned her gaze back to the valley. Somewhere down there would be a road, a river, a village, people who did not know her, who did not know what she had become in those walls. She took a step forward, then another. Each movement felt like tearing away from a snare that had held her too long. The trail narrowed, cutting along the cliff's edge. One slip, and she would fall into the dark pines below. But the idea of falling no longer frightened her. She moved carefully, her hands sliding along the rock wall, her bare feet numb and raw. She whispered to herself as she walked, a single word carried in the wind: free. The word felt heavy and fragile, like a newborn bird in her palm. As the trail bent again, she saw a thin, crooked fence at the far end, marking the beginning of the slope into the valley. Beyond that, a broken wooden sign leaned in the grass, half swallowed by weeds. She nearly collapsed again, the sight of it tearing something open inside her. She stumbled toward it, her mind focused on that final barrier. Her breath came faster, each inhale bright with panic and wild hope. When she reached the fence, she gripped the top rail, her fingers slipping on the dew. She pulled herself over, her body folding and twisting awkwardly. She landed hard on the other side, rolling in the grass. The sky above her spun and blurred. She lay there for a moment, feeling the earth beneath her back, the open sky above. Then, with a shuddering breath, she pushed herself up again. She staggered a few steps, falling to her knees, then crawling forward until she could stand once more. In the valley below, she saw a thin line of smoke rising. A farmhouse, maybe, or a shepherd's hut. She did not know. She did not care. All she knew was that she had crossed. She was beyond his reach now, beyond the narrow halls and locked doors, and the eyes that watched her like a trapped animal. She stood on the slope, her hair tangled and matted, her dress torn and stained with blood and mud. But she was standing. She lifted her face to the morning sky. A sob escaped her lips, followed by a low, broken laugh. The sound rose through the valley, thin and wavering, but alive. She took another step forward, and another. With each step, she left pieces of herself behind. The frightened girl who obeyed, the silent girl who listened, the broken girl who thought she was nothing. What remained was something new, raw, scarred, and uncertain, but her own. She kept walking, her silhouette shrinking against the wide, waking valley. And though every step carried pain and loss, it also carried the quiet, stubborn promise of freedom.